My name is Richard Nelson. I'm from Alaska, and I'm an anthropologist. I also work in radio, and I record natural sounds. You know, it's interesting. We don't pay a lot of attention to natural sounds, and we've forgotten all about the importance of the voices of nature. So we live in this world where we're insulated from this incredible chorus of sounds. It's all around us at all times. And I think in order to understand our world, we need to start listening to what everything around us is saying. We think the human voice is the only one that has come to matter to us. For indigenous people, I think it's very different from that. That all the voices around us, wind and water and ice and animals, they all matter. They're all part of our single language of living things. My research is totally embedded in the world of Alaska, with indigenous people whose lives have been connected with the Alaskan land for thousands of years. And so I can't separate my research from the place where I live and from the people who live there. Everything is all just the one thing. I'm hugely honored to be here, keeping company with all of you, and want to give a very big thank you to Ian and to Michelle and Nicole for all their work to make this amazing gathering possible. Also, thanks so much to Libby Robin, Tom Griffiths, to Mandy Martin and Guy Fitzharding, old friends who have so enriched my experience of Australia over the years. I have an obsessive infatuation with Australia, or maybe it's just places that begin and end with A. I'm from Alaska. It would be more likely the latter. Just Norwegians are simple, straightforward people. Sverker's not here, is he? Well, he's not Norwegian. He'd probably love that statement, actually. Are you, Sverker? Good morning. Anyway, I want to acknowledge, of course, the traditional Garigal owners of this place, whose legacy, it seems to me, whose legacy to all of humankind is the beauty and richness of the Australian land itself. And I'm profoundly grateful to my Inupiaq Eskimo, Gwich'in, and Koyukon Indian teachers in Alaska for their instruction, their friendship, their patience, and their generosity over many years. It's already there. There is a God. For millions of years, the earth was basically, I'm terrified of saying this in front of Jan, was a silent planet. Except, of course, for the sounds of volcanoes and earthquakes and winds and water and ice. Today, we can get some suggestions of that silent world in places like the Arctic and the Antarctic, perhaps out here in the Simpson Desert where that photo was taken. And one example, I think, of perhaps the way the Earth sounded. God, it's tough coming from the far side of the cyber horizon. You feel like you're clawing your way up and you're never going to quite get there. One example, I think, is the many voices of ice, and you'll have to imagine it with the Simpson Desert up there. Here's ice in the spring in the Arctic. This is what's called candle ice. As ice melts, it forms into these wonderful, long, crystal clear candles, and there was a wind blowing, and that ice along the edge of a little lake on the Arctic tundra was making that song. But the Earth before life was mostly an immense, lonely, unyielding silence. And then, after prodigious spans of time, that eternal quiet was broken by the first sounds of life. I like to imagine the little burblings in wet mud, the tiny ticks and scuffles, the hisses, the buzzing, the chirpings, animal sounds beginning, and then eventually gradually increasing, multiplying, and growing into an immense, encompassing planetary chorus. We often identify the Earth uniquely as the blue planet, but I wonder if we couldn't equally distinguish the Earth as the singing planet. This is a magpie just down the street from Tom Griffith and Mandy Robin's house in near Canberra. So it's fun to imagine the Earth whirling through space, sheathed in endless outpourings of sound coming up from this place. Love to think about it every morning in Australia along the east coast as the edge of the dawn comes up. This whole coastline erupting in this amazing pandemonium of sound. Every day, we can experience a drastically condensed version in this way of the Earth evolving from silence into song, as that quiet of night opens into a new sunrise. In Eastern Australia, you'd be familiar with the beginning, the very early, maybe it's the singing of crickets if it's been wet like this, then that painting sound of the yellow robins, often before dawn. Maybe if you're in the right spot, you'll hear a koala bellowing. The first time I heard it, it terrified me. I was way out in the woods all by myself, and I got the hell out of there thinking it was some sort of a big boar that was going to rip me to shreds. Then, of course, the outbursts of the kookaburras, the fluting of the magpies, until the air fills with this great incantation of birds. And probably the most impressive one I've ever heard, I recorded from the front yard of Mandy Martin and Guy Fitzharding. And here's a tiny little piece of that. I tell you absolutely that, oh my goodness, there goes Yothu Yindi. Hang on. Well, they're so eager. I tell you absolutely that I would come all the way to Australia just for one morning of that sound. Well, through nearly all of the Earth's history, these sounds, of course, were heard only by the animals themselves. And then finally, just that long ago in geological time, the first little human voices would have drifted out across the African savanna. Probably inconspicuous among the other animals at first. In fact, they would have been dwarfed by stuff like lions roaring and elephants bellowing, the cackling of hyenas, the noisy congregations of birds. The human voice mixed quietly into that, probably basically inaudibly. Imagine the hunters whispering among themselves, the women talking softly while they were gathering plants, tending children, people sitting around the fire, very quietly a presence in that world. Even the ancient ceremonies and songs probably mingled quite harmoniously with the choruses and rhythms of natural voices. Most of those songs, it seems to me, from the old indigenous traditions seem to emerge from the living land itself, as we can still hear in some of the indigenous communities today. Okay, Yothu Yindi, you can come in now. This is one of my favorite traditional pieces from Yothu Yindi's Freedom album. Now, perhaps equally important, humans, why don't I learn this? Oh, we got it. Yeah, you figure out what that is, and we'll come to it in a minute. I never cease to marvel at my own ineptitude in the cyber world. In fact, I'm a little bit proud of it, actually. You young people have this burden to bear that you understand this stuff. What goes on in these boxes? Who cares? Anyway, perhaps equally important, human beings brought an entirely new kind of listening to life on Earth. People in many traditional cultures, perhaps I should say all traditional cultures as far as I know, live in a constant reciprocal communication with nature. We've been hearing about this, especially yesterday. People find meaning in the sounds and the behaviors of other animals. They also speak to animals and the land, to plants, to waters. Indigenous elders often say that humans and nature share one great language. I think we should listen very closely to what they say on that account. Well, I learned something about this kind of communication during several years when I lived with Inupiaq Eskimo people on the high Arctic coast of Alaska, with Gwich'in Indians and Koyukon Athabaskan Indians in the central part of Alaska. All of these quite far north, just north or on the Arctic Circle. My work there was to document traditional knowledge of the environment, or to work with communities in their own documentation of these things. Their methods of subsistence and survival, their spiritual and social relationships with the natural world. I worked basically in two ways. One was many, every night for years, conversations with elder men and women. And then the other fundamental part of my work was traveling with mostly men, hunters and trappers, staying in the fishing camps, hunting for seal, walrus, waterfowl, caribou, moose, bears, stuff like that. Interesting experience for a guy who grew up being adamantly opposed to hunting, to find myself in the middle of these hunting communities and traditions. It changed my entire way of life. This body today is mostly comprised of deer meat and fish like salmon and halibut, and berries and other gathered plants. Inupiaq and Gwich'in and Koyukon people are incredibly skilled, careful, systematic, scientific observers of everything in their natural environment. They are the greatest experts on their home places. They're not just watchers, they are also acute listeners. To illustrate, here's a couple of little examples of how animal sounds are used in hunting. Inupiaq hunters, Eskimo hunters. In Alaska, we use the word Eskimo because there are two families of Eskimo-speaking people: the Inupiaq, which means real people, and the Yupik, which also means real people. And after you live with them, you believe this. Trust me on it. But you may know the word Inuit, which is simply the plural of human being in those languages. Inupiaq hunters live on the Arctic coast of Alaska, and in the summer they travel by boat out among the fractured ice floes. And one of the animals they search for is called the bearded seal. In English, it's called ugruk in the Inupiaq language. It's a very large animal. I'm not good with kilograms. It weighs about 800 pounds when fully grown. Big. One way to find ugruks is really fascinating. Drift silently in a skin-covered boat. Put a paddle in the water and put your ear to the wooden handle of that paddle and listen for the voice of the diving seal that makes these voices deep underwater, transmitted through the wood. Let's see if we can hear that ugruk. Now, this is just a short clip. That's just a short clip from a longer performance, or whatever you want to call it, by an ugruk under the Arctic Ocean. So that's one way that sound is used to find animals. Koyukon Indian people who live in the sprawling coniferous forest in the interior part of Alaska, an important food for them is black bears.
They often hunt black bears after the first snows cover the ground in the autumn or the early winter. Search widely for the hibernation dens, these tunnels about this big around that bears dig down into the ground, 3, 4, 5 meters long. Down in these dens, there may or may not be a bear. Sometimes the hunters will crawl down inside the den to look. They'll poke down in there with a long stick or a pole and see if that hits something soft. If it's something that moves, they'll know there's a bear inside. Now, it's important to know, is this a young bear that's going to be afraid of you, or is it an older, much more dangerous bear that is not likely to be afraid of you? How would you possibly judge the age of an animal? One Koyukon elder man told me there's a way to do that. Listen for the heartbeat. And he said, if you hear the pounding heart of the bear, it's a young one. It's afraid. I never knew if that was true until I was with biologists doing research on deer who had captured a deer. I was standing probably 3 meters away from them, and the entire air was filled with the sound of that deer's heartbeat. So I know this is true. I just wish I'd had a recorder when those people were working on that deer so I could play it for you. Another animal that's very important to people who live in this great forest in the interior of Alaska, of course, is the grizzly bear, which people like the Koyukon Indians call the brown bear. It's complex taxonomically. We won't go into it. This animal is rarely hunted by Koyukon Indians. Some Inupiaq Eskimo people hunt grizzly bear a lot. But whether you hunt them or not, grizzly bears, of course, are always a concern when you're out on country. For Koyukon people, the brown bear is not just physically dangerous, not just physically powerful. It's also spiritually dangerous. In the pantheon of spiritual powers in the Koyukon world, the grizzly bear is very near the top, and in terms of the intimidation factor, of course, it is on the top. A Koyukon elder once told me, every hair on a brown bear's hide has a life of its own, meaning a spiritual power of its own. He said that's why the grizzly bear can't keep still, can't hold its temper. There's just too much power inside that animal. Well, and it's called, incidentally, in the Koyukon language, the name of it is not spoken by people, usually. They'll often refer to it in English as brown thing, or in their own language as big animal, or something like that. Because to speak the name of the brown bear is too familiar, too disrespectful, just as we may not wish to walk up to the Pope and address him by his first name, or, hey, Pope, how's it going? You would show this profound respect. In fact, the grizzly bear would be a hell of a lot more dangerous than the Pope, I would suggest to you, especially the one we have now, who seems a man of real peace. Anyway, it's easy to understand why people feel this way once you hear what an angry brown bear sounds like at close range. Now let's see if I've got the right thing here. Let me explain 1 second. This is on a great big muddy flat. There's salmon around, and so you'll hear seagulls in the background. These are two brown bears very close to me, as close as the front table here, having an argument over a salmon. They were completely oblivious to me being there. Thank God. Well, that's a little sample of a much longer argument. There was no bloodshed. One bear eventually ended up stealing the salmon from the other one. Great unhappiness out there on the mud flats. This is one of the many reasons that Koyukon Indian people and their 11 other Athabascan groups in the interior of Alaska, why these people always listen carefully to and for animal voices. Let me give you I forgot we have a mother and cub brown bear just right there, and some classic Alaskan scenery for you. Let me give you a little sample in a minute of another bird. It's called a white-crowned sparrow, just a small bird, similar size to the feral English sparrows that live here in Australia. It's very small. It has white on the top of its head and a brown body, and that's relevant to the story that explains this. These stories are called Kadonsedni in the Koyukon Indian language. Kadonsedni means in a distant time it's said. It's like the Aboriginal word that was up here yesterday that somebody used that I won't attempt to replicate, but it explains how the world came to be as it is today. And one of those stories is about the bird that sings this little song. Sorry, that's a bit piercing. Let's hear it one more. We missed the front. Okay, I'm going to play that for you again in a minute, but let me explain. In the ancient time, a hunter was struggling through the soft, deep snow of spring, trying to get to a camp called Tsitiklat. And as he came to the crest of a hill and looked down, there in the valley was Tsitiklat. He was starving, he was weak, he began moving through the snow, fell and died. He was wearing a white headband made from dentalium shells. And when he died, he was transformed and flew up into the air with the white headband still showing in his feathers. And he sang this song, okay? It says, "Yes, Tsitiklat." It means, too bad I never made it to Tsitiklat. And since the ancient time of Kadonsedni, the white-crowned sparrow has been singing, "Yes, Tsitiklat." It's called Kitlinza Hatana, which means the white headband man. Okay, another voice from the Koyukon world is that of the northern raven. Looks almost identical, a bit bigger, but identical to the multiple species of Australian crows and ravens. This bird is the creator of the world. Perhaps like the rainbow serpent. I'm very reluctant to say that because I don't understand that, of course. But these sacred Kadonsedni stories explain that the raven created the world and recreated it and made it difficult for everybody. Humans were first made from stone, and they thought, oh, that's way too easy. They live forever, so he recreated us from clay so that we would die. The rivers flowed both ways, so people never had to paddle. They could go this way on one side of the river and that way on the other side of the river. Way too easy. Changed it so they only flow one direction. That's the raven, who's called Dotsan in the Koyukon language, or Tsikas, which means old grandfather. Highly intelligent, endlessly varied voice. Here's a bit of it. And that's just it's nice to hear the Anthropocene coming in here too. We'll get to that in a minute. The raven has a benevolent spirit. It will help people. It'll protect people. One of its calls goes, caw, 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 and you could sort of hear that. It means animal, animal. If the raven does that, especially if it tips upside down in the skies, if it's dropping the meat out of its backpack, it's saying, animal, this way. And so you go in the direction that the raven tells you, and it's said that you're much more likely to find game. I use that method all the time where I live. So it does this, and it helps people to find game. Is this benevolence? Is this philanthropy? No, because the raven knows it will get what you leave for it. Raven is this combination of trickster and God. Amazing thing to think about is that when you hear the voice of the raven, in the Koyukon way of thinking, if I understand correctly, you are literally hearing the voice of God in your everyday life. Well, Koyukon people also have a great love for the beauty in the world, which is called nizun, beauty. It has many different words. beauty in the natural world. And one of the greatest beauties is a bird called the common loon. Some of you may know what they look like. A big waterfowl with an exquisite black and white geometric plumage. This is one of North America's most beautiful and powerful voices. I dare to say this in a country that has the most exquisite bird voices anywhere. But here's our loon, singing on a lake in the Arctic, in the mountains, calling for its mate, and its mate will answer at the end. You hear it echoing from the mountainside, and the mate very briefly coming in there at the end. That's a voice most people from the northern part of North America revere. And in the Koyukon world, the same is true. One Koyukon elder told me an old saying, "Ots a dodzin ton rido bizni inish on." It means when a loon calls on a lake, it's the sound against which all other sounds are measured. It's the greatest sound a human can hear, he said. And he also went on to explain that the loon's beautiful voice and its elegant plumage are manifestations of the loon's spiritual power. It's not a purely physical thing. So for Koyukon people, we can look objectively and empirically and scientifically at half of the world. The other half, the spiritual side, is equally huge, equally important, but absolutely invisible and accessible only through the minds and memories of the elder people. Well, this tradition of intense listening and communication with nature that's seen, I think, among hunting and gathering people, at least throughout the world, and it has probably exists throughout all of human history, I strongly believe. I think this is the fundamentally human way of seeing the world. It's the way that we are on this great experiment of throwing away and ignoring, and in the process, I think, of discovering it doesn't work. It does not work to abandon this way that is based on the principle that the natural world is filled with intelligence, with awareness, with spiritual power. That the natural world is a place that commands of us obedience and respect. And humans are members then of this one great encompassing community of life. It's the single most obvious thing anyone could say. And the single most staggering thing that a culture could forget that. Of course, we know that every natural sound, every song, every tiny splinter of sound that we hear out in the natural world reveals to us a unique living creature. Every single one, if you know it well enough, as the true ornithologists and bird watchers do, and the twitchers, they know this. They can identify birds by the most amazingly tiny bits of sound. And for people like the Koyukon Indians and their compatriots around the world, there is that further dimension that every animal's voice means something powerful and significant is nearby. Something to be acknowledged, something perhaps even to be understood. A Koyukon elder told me once, and he told me this many times actually, remember this. Every animal knows way more than you do. He reminded me of that often. But this way of knowing the world is being forgotten. It's now only like a whisper from a distant, rapidly vanishing past. Over the last 10,000 years or so, of course, indigenous ways of knowing have been steadily displaced by the spread of agricultural and urban humankind. What my friend, filmmaker and writer, Canadian-British Hugh Brody calls the Neolithic catastrophe. At the same time that this is happening, our imprint on the earth, of course, as we've been hearing, is becoming exponentially larger and exponentially louder. The voices of the insects and birds, the frogs, the mammals, are being drowned out and overwhelmed. Even the other night down here having dinner, where there was a phenomenal, glorious thunderstorm going on, those of us who were sitting in the restaurant could hardly hear the thunder for the sound of our own voices. And I would suggest we missed something really important there. I have to put up my picture of that to remind us. This process has reached its crescendo with the mechanized pandemonium of the industrial age. Imagine now the collective racket that's pouring up from the earth, which Jan points out. None of these sounds, they're the one thing I think you said, Jan, that's not fossilized. They may find our ballpoint pens, but they won't find the sounds of that demolition team going on across the way, or the birds. Imagine the collective racket that's now pouring up from the earth, the pounding and clattering, the grinding, the clang, the booming, the screeching, the rumbling, the reverberating. I've tried to catch a little bit of that, some of it just this past week. And that last bit I need to tell you was at the corner of Berry Drive and Northbourne Avenue, recorded by Libby and Tom's son Billy Griffith about a week ago. And so our ancient Earth then was a silent planet. Earth then became the singing planet, and now it's the roaring planet. The modern outburst of human noise is among the greatest transformations in the history of the earth and a major hallmark of the Anthropocene. Not surprisingly, there are growing concerns about the impact of noise on human health, on our quality of life. For example, there are big initiatives to monitor intrusive human sounds in national parks. The U.S. National Park Service has a huge initiative to put microphones out to catch this. There are studies of the effects of our human noise on wildlife. Some birds near busy highways, noisy highways, are apparently changing their song frequencies to make themselves audible amid the roar of the traffic. Well, we've seen enough, I think, of the freeway. This was taken from a ridge near Bombala, New South Wales, if you know where that is. Another impact on natural sounds is that animal sounds are being progressively displaced by agriculture, by forestry, industrial development, the growth of cities and suburbs. And as each species vanishes, another voice is lost from the living chorus. While human noise is growing, natural sounds are diminishing. Interesting, except maybe the sounds of cyclones and stuff like that. Interestingly, many studies are using sound to survey the species that remain in particular places or to search for rare species. You may be aware of the use of remote microphones placed out in Central Australia, trying to listen for the voice of the night parrot. Is it still there? Is it still making sound? At the same time, this ancient human tradition of careful attention to environmental sounds is rapidly vanishing in most of the world. Few people among us have any idea what bird or animal they're hearing. Studies show that even rural children only recognize a few of the most common and conspicuous voices, like magpies, crows, ravens in this part of the world, maybe butcher birds if you get the right kid. In fact, most of us literally do not hear the natural voices that are perfectly audible to us because we're not paying attention and we're not interested. We focus almost exclusively on hearing our own sounds. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but we're forgetting the rest. It's a profound change in how human beings connect with their environment and the species that share our world. We are forgetting the language of the earth. We're giving up a fundamental aspect of our citizenship in the community of life. We're losing touch with that marvelous, vital, fascinating dimension of our world that comes to us through natural sounds. Here's one example, and I'm getting very close to the end. Here's one example that my friend Debbie, who's here, and I found absolutely stunning and surprising partly because it's so amazing, partly because it was totally unexpected to us. This is in the Daintree. Part of a riff that goes on and on and on, a little brown bird that lives on the forest floor. Some of you may know it. We certainly didn't until we met it that way. Voices like this, if you ask me, are an absolute miracle. They have evolved over millions of years, and they sound unlike any other voices on our planet. Is it possible to fathom the magnitude of the loss if a voice like the sound of the chowchilla should vanish from the earth? We have inherited a vast legacy of sound bequeathed to us by ancestors far wiser than ourselves. For countless millennia, these voices have been wholly integrated into every day of the lives of people around the world in indigenous communities. And still today, every time we walk outdoors, we're stepping into that great chorus of life and weather, the whispering, murmuring, huffing, roaring, groaning, fluting, chanting voices that come to us completely free for everyone. All we have to do is listen. By ignoring these natural sounds and forgetting who makes them, we are creating a great loneliness for ourselves in the world. But we can learn again how to listen. I speak from experience on this one. Luckily, we're starting to do some things right by creating and maintaining ecological diversity on agricultural and pastoral lands in cities and suburbs, even in yards. We can all do it. And importantly, we're working to preserve the full diversity of wild environments and species. A key part of this, of course, is setting up protected areas, restoring natural landscapes, national parks, nature reserves. We should recognize that these places, these protected places, are not just to preserve scenery, not just to preserve ecosystems, but to preserve voices. Places where we can hear the grand chorus and cacophony of nature. In our time of despair for the future, perhaps our time of great sadness, these voices are a source for hope. We can listen to them and hear them in that way, and we can do everything in our power to make sure that they stay here. Imagine a child asking, let me see if I can get this sound for you in a minute. Imagine a child asking, what did the earth sound like before there were cities and machines, before there were jet planes and highways? Instead of trying to explain it, as we often do, why not take that child to a place like a national park or far out onto the ocean and say, let's listen. Here is the voice of the earth, and here's one of those voices. I'm so happy that I chose it because we're going to hear more about these animals just a bit later. Humpback whale, blowing, lobtailing. Recorded near my home in southeastern Alaska. In closing, I want to say this. There's beauty and mystery in every cranny of our world. All of nature is a community to which we ourselves belong. And all of us here together are the earth singing to itself. Thank you. Thank you.
With the Alaskan land for thousands of years. And so I can't separate my research from the place where I live and from the people who live there. Everything is all just the one thing.
I'm hugely honored to be here, keeping company with all of you, and want to give a very big thank you to Ian and to Michelle and Nicole for all their work to make this amazing gathering possible. Also, thanks so much to Libby Robin, Tom Griffiths, to Mandy Martin and Guy Fitzharding, old friends who have so enriched my experience of Australia over the years. I have an obsessive infatuation with Australia, or maybe it's just places that begin and end with A. I'm from Alaska. It would be more likely the latter. Just Norwegians are simple, straightforward people. Sverker's not here, is he? Well, he's not Norwegian. He'd probably love that statement, actually. Are you, Sverker? Good morning. Anyway, I want to acknowledge, of course, the traditional Garigal owners of this place, whose legacy, it seems to me, whose legacy to all of humanity. This is what's called candle ice. As ice melts, it forms into these wonderful, long, crystal clear candles. And there was a wind blowing, and that ice along the edge of a little lake on the Arctic tundra was making that song. But the earth before life was mostly an immense, lonely, unyielding silence. And then, after prodigious spans of time, that eternal quiet was broken by the first sounds of life. I like to imagine the little burblings in wet mud, the tiny ticks and scuffles, the hisses, the buzzing, the chirpings, animal sounds beginning, and then eventually gradually increasing, multiplying, and growing into an immense, encompassing planetary chorus. We often identify the Earth uniquely as the blue planet, but I wonder if we couldn't equally distinguish the Earth as the singing planet. This is a magpie just down the street from Tom Griffith. Mankind is the beauty and richness of the Australian land itself. And I'm profoundly grateful to my Inupiaq Eskimo, Gwich'in, and Koyukon Indian teachers in Alaska for their instruction, their friendship, their patience, and their generosity over many years. It's already there. There is a God. For millions of years, the earth was basically, I'm terrified of saying this in front of Jan, was a silent planet. Except, of course, for the sounds of volcanoes and earthquakes and winds and water and ice. Today we can get some suggestions of that silent world in places like the Arctic and the Antarctic, perhaps out here in the Simpson Desert where that photo was taken. And one example, I think, of perhaps the way the Earth sounded. God, it's tough coming from the far side of the cyber horizon. You feel like you're clawing your way up and you're never going to quite get there. One example, I think, is the many voices of ice. And you'll have to imagine it with the Simpson Desert up there. Here's ice in the spring in the Arctic. And Mandy Robin's house in near Canberra. So it's fun to imagine the Earth whirling through space, sheathed in endless outpourings of sound coming up from this place. Love to think about it every morning in Australia along the east coast as the edge of the dawn comes up. This whole coastline erupting in this amazing pandemonium of sound. Every day we can experience a drastically condensed version in this way of the earth evolving from silence into song. as that quiet of night opens into a new sunrise. In Eastern Australia, you'd be familiar with the beginning, the very early, maybe it's the singing of crickets if it's been wet like this, then that painting sound of the yellow robins, often before dawn. Maybe if you're in the right spot, you'll hear a koala bellowing. The first time I heard it, it terrified me. I was way out in the woods all by myself, and I got the hell out of there thinking it was some sort of a big boar that was going to rip me to shreds. Then, of course, the outbursts of the kookaburras, the fluting of the magpies, until the air fills with this great incantation of birds. And probably
My name is Richard Nelson. I'm from Alaska, and I'm an anthropologist. I also work in radio, and I record natural sounds. You know, it's interesting. We don't pay a lot of attention to natural sounds, and we've forgotten all about the importance of the voices of nature. So we live in this world where we're insulated from this incredible chorus of sounds. It's all around us at all times. And I think in order to understand our world, we need to start listening to what everything around us is saying. We think the human voice is the only one that has come to matter to us. For indigenous people, I think it's very different from that. That all the voices around us, wind and water and ice and animals, they all matter. They're all part of our single language of living things. My research is totally embedded in the world of Alaska with indigenous people whose lives have been connected